I'm going to really focus on three issues. One is institutional capacity, and that takes quite a few kind of forms. Secondly, look at the networks that are emerging, and finally, look at the funding possibilities that are beginning to emerge in the marketplace. And the institutional capacity really is to give context that when we talk about innovation and research and development of new products, the one key gap in the African market is the lack of really developed institutions that can drive the innovation process. Those institutions are in the form of either the funding institutions or private sector, big pharma, health sector businesses that tends to drive R&D and innovations in their own marketplaces. Secondly, the issue of dependency on imported products, and which in fact, by definition, lead to the third point is the underdevelopment of the manufacturing capabilities and industrial sector within the African economies. But I think that the disruption of COVID has demonstrated there are possibilities to emerge and to look at innovative solutions in the ventilators and CPAPs and rapid diagnostics tests that have been emerging in the local markets. The fourth point on institutions is just the lack of coherent strategy to support local innovation, both in government and in the public sector. But I think that despite all these constraints and challenges I'm pointing out, there's evidence that intellectual property alliances are emerging. I think the experience around the coronavirus vaccine development processes, where South African institutions, both academic and private, have been linking up with big pharma and other institutions in the north to look at, to really test and develop the issues around coronavirus. And I think that this is a trend that needs to be encouraged, a trend that should really move away from closed systems that exist at the moment, being dominated by big pharma in the north, and try and open up into more open innovation ecosystems. And I think that the collaborative networks that are emerging and the fact that African institutions have built capacity to do the validation, the testing, the research that is required to validate some of the products that are emerging out of the laboratories in this market. Firstly, the market, it's cheap to do this here in Africa. And I think that we need to continue to make sure that those collaborative networks are entrenched. The other point is, I think there's an emerging evidence that local businesses and new entrepreneurs and scientists and social innovators are beginning to look at working together and collaborating in the system and investing in their own local sectors and local economies to develop new products and solutions that address the local problems. Because, innovations are more than anything, they are, processes to address existing local problems. And I think that just on the funding side, I think there are traditional funding capabilities, largely state, provincial, local government, state-funded research institutions, and large corporations that use their own resources to fund innovation and local development. Unfortunately, budget constraints in the African context, the lack of deep developed manufacturing companies with deep pockets that can fund innovation is a problem. But as I said earlier, I think there's evidence that local entrepreneurs are increasingly making investments into the local market. Collaboration between the African diaspora and people in various universities who have much more interest in driving innovation and research and development in the African context I think it's a process that needs to be deepened and really driven further. I think there is evidence emerging of angel investors within the African context and venture capital participants, both locally and internationally, who are beginning to look at supporting innovation systems and ecosystems in the African context. Finally, family networks, crowdfunding solutions that are beginning to support innovations in the local market is an interesting emerging trend that we're seeing in the market. So I'm going to stop there, Dr. Msomi. I hope I've done my 3 minutes spiel.
Thank you for that, Moss. You did a good 3 minutes, and you are over by a couple of seconds, but those will be taken back later. I'm keeping score. I think the next person on your left was Andre Crawford Brandt, and I would like to invite Andre to share his perspective. Andre, you've been involved at the Oxford Sciences Innovation, and I believe, at least from your profile, that 2 of the companies that you guys have funded have produced 2 vaccines for the COVID-19, one of which is the AstraZeneca one. Could you maybe take us through that journey, how you think about that experience being extrapolated or transferred to doing things in our part of the world? And by the way, I must hasten to add that the entire panel is made up of South Africans. One way or the other, wherever they live, they are South Africans. And Mr. Mwasheng has alluded to the diaspora. Hopefully they get back to the country to their money. Over to you, Andre.
Dr. Msomi, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay with you, and walk through a couple of slides relating to, as you touched on, Oxford Sciences Innovation, which I think kind of covers a couple of the points that Moss made vis-a-vis collaboration, sources of funding, macro trends in the market. So let me see if I can put it up. Has that come up?
Yep, yeah. I see them.
Okay,
yeah, we can see it.
So in short, I think this is an interesting journey because I think there's a playbook for South African research institutions. Obviously, Oxford is a very pedigreed research institution. As most of us know, it's an 800- or 900-year-old institution. And when we started doing analysis back in 2015, the goal was to figure out in the UK, you know, what I call the translational gap was between how come, you know, the US universities were able to produce some of the biggest, you know, sort of life sciences and tech companies in the world, and the UK universities weren't able to. And effectively, it boiled down to a couple of things: network, ecosystem, talent, and capital. Recognizing the quality of the brand and the quality of the institution that is Oxford, we set about trying to recognize what we could do in order to sort of leverage this intellectual or academic edge, as I call it. So, you know, starting with the world's best science, the goal was to build some of the world's, you know, game-changing businesses. Oxford, as I've touched on already, #1 university globally, 56 Nobel Prize winners. I don't think anyone needs any introduction. You know, it's where the lithium-ion battery, it's where penicillin came from, it's where the blood glucose monitor was invented. And effectively, what I liked about what Oxford Sciences Innovation was set up to do was, you know, raise a large amount of capital in an evergreen company structure to be able to monetize the IP coming out of Oxford University. So we raised 600-odd million pounds back in 2015, and we've been using that to deploy into various companies, you know, where the IP is generated in the university. The alignment of interest between the university and OSI is pretty straightforward. We share equally with them in all companies spun out from the university. They have a stake in Oxford Sciences Innovation, and they have a number of board members. The goal is pretty simple: marry science with entrepreneurs and investments, vision, capital, people. Dr. Msomi, as you've heard me say many times, if you're addressing really large problems, you find the smartest people in the world, you have edge with respect to IP, good things are going to happen. As I said, we've raised from some of the largest sovereign wealth funds, some of the largest institutions. Moss touched on, the kind of sources of capital. I think, this was, really a phenomenal exercise in getting some of the biggest institutions to, buy into this vision we had of translating IP into commercial businesses. We asked 3 questions when we began. Was there enough IP in Oxford to justify the biggest IP fund in the world? The answer categorically 6 years in is we have more IP, I think, in Oxford than some of the biggest companies in the world. Could we add value in the process from an OSI perspective by building out a team of the smartest people from Bain, McKinsey, and Goldman to help improve the probability of success? The answer to that categorically, I think, is yes. We've spun out 100 companies in the last 5 years. You touched on Vaccitech, obviously the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. That IP was generated in the university from the Jenner Institute and is one of a number of platform technologies that ultimately we're bringing to market and are going to have significant impact. The goal is pretty simple: from pre-seed through seed to Series A. The focus of what I call business building as opposed to really investing, bringing the right people together, bringing network together, and combining that with the right amount of capital and the right amount of co-investors, leads to phenomenal outcomes. That's pretty much an overview. As we said, 100 companies. We're looking to expand by 10 to 15 companies per annum. We think we'll invest £1 billion between now and 2025. And I think the third-party capital needs across the portfolio will be about 3 billion. So this is a big exercise in creating a large amount of value. I love this chart, and this is where I'll pause, because effectively, I think it just shows, since the formation of OSI, what's setting up a dedicated team, having purpose and focus, empowering academics, and, appreciating the valuation arbitrage between, what's happening in the West Coast or East Coast of the US and what's happening in Oxford. Money has started to flow more freely. Certainly, I think if I look at my career, the 3 innings, the first bit, the late 90s, the smartest minds went to work on Wall Street building algorithms. Post the financial crisis, I think we saw migration of the smartest engineers and talent to some of the big tech companies, creating algorithms to keep our eyeballs on a screen and sell us things we didn't know we didn't need. The third iteration of that, I think, in a post-COVID world is where the smartest people migrate to solve some of the most pressing problems, be it infectious disease, climate change, and cancer. And, I'm just hugely encouraged that, what a combination of those 3 things, vision, capital, and people, can do. I think there's a playbook for this now. I see some of the northern universities on the process of emulating what we're doing at Oxford. I think there's an arbitrage for South Africa to capitalize on based on licensing some of the upstream IP, running local cost-effective clinical trials in South Africa that, we're very well placed to do. And, you touched on the number of South Africans on this panel. Dr. Msomi, 2 of the biggest companies in our portfolio are founded by Professor Matthew Wood, who's a South African. The technology around using exosomes and using peptides as a new targeted drug delivery. So hopefully you have a flavor for how excited I am. This is one of the most attractive investment opportunities. And I think, we'll continue to see money move into the space. I think, post-COVID world has become easier to attract talent as we've all become connected. For the first time I've invested in a company when I've never actually met the company. I think that bodes really well for Oxford. So I think, as at the risk of repeating myself, I think there's a big opportunity for us to look at this playbook, figure out where we have edge and advantage within our ecosystem, and figure out a way to leverage it more formally. The GDP multiplier effect is significant from these spinouts. I'll leave you with one stat. The demand from our portfolio companies for lab space for next year will be equivalent to the demand for lab space for the last 10 to 15 years. So, you can kind of start to see the exponential impact this has, not only on the Oxford ecosystem, but the UK. And, as the UK has become less relevant in retail, in banking, in brewing, you can see a definite shift of government focus, recognizing, not only can we solve some of the most pressing challenges and problems, but, we can do it in the UK and have a knock-on effect to both GDP and the overall country. I'll pause there, Dr. Msomi.
Thank you, Andre. We'll pick it up a bit later. The next person I'm going to request to give us just an opening perspective is somebody that I've run with for a bit longer than most, Paul Abrams. I remember him when he started AfricaBio, which was the first, if not one of the first, but I think it was the first biotechnology incubator in the country and in the continent. And that was over 20 years ago. And so he's walked the journey to where he is now. He's a serial entrepreneur. So he's not just an investor, but he's an entrepreneur himself. And I'd like for him just to give a perspective on the topic of innovative financing solutions. Paul.
Thanks, Nhlanhla. So I thought you were going to say you remember me when I had hair. But yeah, sadly, I didn't have any then and I don't have any now. So yeah, thanks for the kind introduction. Yeah, I think I'd probably give a fairly unique perspective as a healthcare entrepreneur, having built businesses in the space, both in South Africa and in the UK. As you mentioned, I was the founding CEO of AfricaBio, also was involved as a founding trustee on BioPad, which now is wrapped up in TIA. And in those early days, I think the likes of AfricaBio as a biotech incubator was a little ahead of its time, certainly on the African continent. The reason for setting that up in the early days was that I'd come out of Oxford, having worked for one of the Oxford spin-outs, which had listed on the London Stock Exchange. I did my thesis with them and continued to work for them for a while. And I thought that there was unique opportunity to take that experience and try and capitalize on the IP that even in those early days was certainly being generated within South African academia and the likes of the CSIR. And so, setting up AfricaBio gave us a unique opportunity to try and take some of that IP and commercialize it. I think that the challenge that we faced then was actually, to a large extent, getting buy-in from the academics that their intellectual property was in fact commercializable, and that it wasn't rude or against the run of the mill to actually make some money out of your hard work as a scientist. So that mind shift took some time to achieve, certainly within the Oxford environment a long time ago, and certainly within the South African environment as recently as sort of 15 years ago. Subsequent to that, I was involved in the setting up of a couple of healthcare businesses that were, in fact, again, spin-outs of CSIR intellectual property. And I think some of the big challenges that I and my partners faced at the time was around raising capital and trying to find the funding for these businesses. It was extremely limited in those days. I think it is less limited at this point, certainly in the South African environment, but nevertheless a challenge to try and actually raise the capital for these early stage businesses. As Moss alluded to earlier, in those days there was no such thing really as angel investors and sort of early stage seed investors and venture capital funds focused in this particular space, because biotech, life sciences, etc., was fairly new. If we jump forward to 10 years, I've taken that experience into the UK market, where again have set up a couple of businesses and then got involved in a couple of life sciences businesses. Again, one is a spin out from Manchester University, which is an allergy diagnostics business, and really repeating the experience of going through this challenge of funding really early stage spin-outs, particularly in the life science space. So, what I would say is that the challenge has been, the challenge is there, and it remains tough. I don't think I found it any easier here than I did in the South African context. Safe to say that there might just be a bigger pool of funds to try and tap into, but you're in a pool with 1,000 other people trying to tap into similar funding. So the ratios remain the same. Interestingly, in the last couple of years, we have raised money and I've invested back into the South African and Lesotho environments in the medicinal cannabis space. And some of the challenges that we faced there, bringing in UK-based angel investors into a South African or African-based environment, it was quite interesting, listening to their perspectives on the risks that they perceived about funding businesses that were well out of their jurisdiction. And I think you get the usual around sovereign risk. There's sort of jurisdictional legal frameworks, your regulatory frameworks that foreign investors are not au fait with, issues around sort of exchange control, current currency risks, and one in particular that is that sort of always rears its head is around the intellectual property risks. And particularly in light of, I'm not au fait with the current situation around transfer of intellectual property offshore from South Africa. But certainly 10, 15 years ago, that was an unresolved issue, and it was a fairly big issue that we were trying to grapple with at the time. And so, the questions remain the same, and no matter which jurisdiction you're in, and the challenges remain the same. But nevertheless, there are answers, and we've been fairly successful, in both the sort of Southern African jurisdiction and the European, or particularly the UK jurisdiction, in terms of answering these challenges and these questions, raising money, building businesses quite successfully, I think that the opportunity is there. Certainly, as Andre had mentioned, the opportunity is there to try and give exposure to some of the great companies that are coming out of South Africa, and certainly to try and, I don't think it's a case of having to build a business or a brand out of South Africa in its entirety, but sort of collaborative efforts with South African academia, researchers, small businesses, and funders, distribution channels, whatever the case may be, in the rest of the world, including the UK. So I don't have any slides. Or I do actually, but I've just read off them. So yeah, that's my spiel, and happy to take questions a bit later.
Thank you, Paul. And I think we are going to move on to somebody who is right at the coal face with startups at the Technology Innovation Agency, Mr. Brian Patrelle, who has a basic training in biotechnology as well as intellectual property law. He's an admitted patent attorney. So he's got some perspectives around commercialization as an executive at the Technology Innovation Agency. So maybe a few perspectives, Brian.
Thanks, Nhlanhla. Can you confirm the slides are showing? Can you all see the slides, gentlemen?
All good, Brian.
Right, thanks. Please move to the next slide. Right, my slides are really calibrated against the purpose why we do what we do as TIA, and I'm glad that all of you seem to have some familiarity with the company that I represent. So now, as a matter of course, we exist to support commercialization. That's why we are talking about financing on this platform. And the manner in which we prefer to do it, necessarily, we have a strong bias towards new venture creation. And why that? It is so because we believe that new ventures represent a better and a bigger opportunity for us to eat away at the problem of job or joblessness. Now, we do that in certain instances where we believe that there are candidate IP that warrants resources that often are required to go into new ventures. And that you normally find that when you've got a platform IP from which you can spin off a number of products, it's easier to convince investors. And also, when the IP so identified is patented in the world's, I guess, biggest and growing markets, you can easier secure the investor's interest. And lastly, we recognize that the IP system exists hand in hand with the publication system. But so I'm referring to the fact that the scientific rigor that you will find in a typical peer review journals before publications are accepted is a lot stricter. The bar is a lot higher than you would find in the patent system. Now, this, colleagues, is a deliberate choice of preference from a commercialization standpoint in terms of tier. Now, secondly, I guess to a lesser extent, we also support commercialization where it is effected via arm's length means. Next slide, sir. Now, in terms of tier historic, I would say, funding practices, we do this through what we call a direct commercialization mode. And what does that mean? So the recipient of the tier resources is an entity that will be actualizing the invention from a sales standpoint. Now, how we structure our quid pro quo from such funding transactions, we structure that based on royalties, which are levied on the top line for obvious reasons. And we only start getting those from when products reach the sales stage. If that doesn't happen for whatever reason, mostly technical, we simply write them off and look forward to the next opportunity. Now, in parallel to that, we also pursue what we commonly refer to as indirect commercialization, which, as I said in the previous slide, really speaks to finding somebody who has got existing manufacturing capabilities, distribution lines, on which the new IP so developed can be, can piggyback, because often not every single piece of IP funded warrants the resources required to set up a new venture. Now, the tier money specifically goes more towards the part that I've highlighted on my slide. So we first of all require proof of concept as the entry ticket to the tier dance, if I may use that phrase in this instance. And once you have that, we take your IP towards a demonstration phase where, from a commercial standpoint, you are able to show that your key components in your envisioned solution can actually work, but they don't have to look like they will in their final form. That's why tier money takes you. And also, from that point onwards, we fund prototyping. And what that means is that you will have your final product in the way that it looks and functions when fully available for commercialization, excepting that it wouldn't be coming off a manufacturing line, because that, and the reason why it is de-emphasized, is that typically that's where next stage funders come from. Now, next slide. Now we have, and I must say that naturally, as a cause of evolution of the entity that I represent, we've built a portfolio over the last decade or so of opportunities. Now, quite frankly, I must say that by sheer nature of the business that we chose to participate in or to play in, it is obvious, I guess, that there will be a number of misses than there will be hits. But that said, we still do find that we end up with a few hits. And when we do, we have found that the manner in which we invest, as illustrated in my previous slide, where we use instruments like royalties, tends to represent a cash flow, a cash outflow commitment for those startups that we purport to support. Now that it is proving from experience to be a leveraging disincentive in terms of follow-on capital, because in almost all cases, after we invest, we always need a bigger investor to take the opportunities that we support to the next level. Now, apart from it being a disincentive, an argument can be made that when a startup has a prior encumbrance in the form of a cash outflow commitment, it also does injustice to the valuation of such startups, which is also required later from an expansion capital standpoint. Now, we also are having challenges from a premature redemption certainty standpoint in the way that we do this, because it provides for lack of optionality from an exit standpoint. Last one, saying. Now, the reason why we have taken a keen interest in this conversation is that A, we are experiencing challenges in the manner that we typically invest, but most importantly, we've got a national economic imperatives that, which we must respond to. And in this case, we as a technology development finance house, we have to raise our hand in terms of opportunities which we can use to effect meaningful economic transformation. Now, by this, I'm referring to those few hits that actually work and our assumptions are proven to be correct and you are able to achieve sales. We have to start the discourse with the BBBE exit partners. And this is not just shoving money down a black pocket. We are identifying those entrepreneurs of darker pigmentation who represent some form of mutually symbiotic economic partnerships, be it vertical or horizontal economic integration from a standpoint. But the point here is that we need to be able to bring them in effecting meaningful economic transformation. And the instrument that is more commonly used suffers lack of sustainability and lock-in from the point of view of bringing them on board in terms of exit partners. Now, the shortcomings of this popular instrument has been severely exposed, and we are here because, as a matter of purpose, we are here because we have started pursuing alternatives to this royalty-based funding, I would say, but also one which is congruent with the early stage nature of the things that we typically support. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. The next person I would like to invite to give us a perspective. When we started, Stephen, you were not here, and I alluded to the fact that this could be a Friday afternoon session at my house, at the Msomi house. But I'm now elevating it to a Friday afternoon session of the Sussex alumni, because we started this conversation today with Morse Mwashing, who is a Sussex alumnus, and we're closing with you, Stephen, another Sussex alumnus. I'm not boasting, but I'm just saying, over to you, sir.
And Dr. Msomi, another Sussex alumnus, is chairing it.
Okay, okay. All right, Stephen, if you could just take us through your perspectives, Stephen.
Yeah, I did send a slide presentation over, but I don't think it's necessary. And I've got it here just as an aid for myself, which is fine. But thanks for inviting me here today. And it's great to see the level of sophistication of people that are getting involved in South Africa and trying to get things moving in South Africa. And of course, from the earlier presentation, seeing what's going on at OSI, which I think is formidably impressive, actually. But although I have experience of venture capital in Western Europe and North America, I'm remarkably unsophisticated in terms of understanding what's going on in South Africa, and I'm learning as I sit in this meeting. So I think what I'm going to cover very briefly is just to introduce myself. You've got a bit of background on that from my bio, but of course I was born in Cape Town, and I still miss it intensely to this day. But I've been a long time in venture capital, which I probably couldn't have done in Cape Town at the time. So I'm going to cover venture strategy very briefly in life sciences from a Western European and US perspective, not in any depth, but really just to alert you to some of the things that came about as being quite important. And in terms of a strategy for a country. And obviously, in any situation, there's got to be a huge emphasis on high quality science and strong management. And I think in South Africa, it always strikes me how much energy, enthusiasm, and drive there is. And there is a lot of experienced management around at various levels, not necessarily in the biotech sector, but in terms of running businesses. South Africa is an entrepreneurial country, and it seems to have grown in that sense since I left at the age of 10. And since I've watched it over the last 20 years when I've been visiting regularly. So I think the issue of science, of course, is a challenge in that the size of the science budget and the size of the economy overall is very hard to compete with Western Europe and North America. And I think we, for example, have never made any investments in Australia. It's too small an economy, and the overall science budget is not there, albeit there is very strong science in pockets there, very much so. So I think I wanted to comment, though, on the importance of geography and location in our industry. If you are in an unusual part of America and you start your company there, it's actually very difficult to draw in capital, and everything is more difficult. So it tends to be a sector which operates in clusters. And in America, there are pretty much only two clusters, which is the Bay Area and Boston. And you sort of wonder why haven't they been able to stretch it from there? And you can ask the same question: why can't they replicate, Harvard and Stanford and other parts of America? Well, they can to a point, but it's never quite the same. And in the UK, we have 3 clusters, I suppose. We have Oxford, Cambridge, and London, and that's all centered around the universities. And you say, well, why is that? And part of it is because scientists, good scientists in particular, are actually relatively elitist people. They like to be around other scientists who have high standards, and they like to be together. And because being around a Nobel Prize winner, maybe some of it rubs off on you. And you know what? That's probably true. So they tend to form clusters, and also there's a huge amount of infrastructure that you need in terms of launching a biotech company. You need access to experienced lawyers, patent agents, investment bankers, recruiters, people who understand your industry and know who the right people are. This is difficult to replicate across any country. It's not easy. And so I think it reminded me, many years ago, I met with they were Americans actually, and they decided to set up a company in South Africa, in Cape Town. And we asked them, why did they choose Cape Town? And they said, well, because of the lifestyle. And I said, well, we have a life sciences fund. We're working on the lifestyle fund when I retire. But basically, in other words, it's quite difficult to get all the resources in one place at the time that I met these people, which is quite some years ago, by the way. And I'm sure things have changed. But so for South Africa, the question is, what's the ideal thing to be doing? And I don't know how relevant this is for the kinds of businesses that are being funded. But if you're going for a heavy science approach, it would be helpful to be mainly in one location where a cluster can be supported. I would imagine it would have to be 2 in South Africa. But I think for Africa, if you think of any country in Africa, South Africa must be the one which is the best qualified to support such a complex area as starting a biotech company and finishing it. It is hard for South Africa to compete on science because of the topics I mentioned earlier. But focusing on South Africa's strengths, medicine is clearly an area of strength. There's a lot of expertise in HIV. There are no doubt other areas, and that's the place to be starting, whether it's manufacturing vaccines or clinical trials organizations. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear on what people feel are the areas of strength in South Africa, or in generic businesses to serve local needs. So I think, for discussion is, what are South Africa's real strengths? What does South Africa or Africa need? And in what sector of life sciences might an African company have an edge or the best chance to excel? And I'll sign off on that. Thank you.
I'm going to ask a few questions. The first one I'm going to direct to you, Andre, not because I'm picking on you, but because you're currently active. And really, it's a follow-up from what Stephen has mentioned about and I think earlier on, Paul, South Africa's trend in clinical research. Stephen threw a question around CROs. And I'm just wondering if, being where you are investing in discovery, science, innovation, upstream, whether you see any opportunities for what, for lack of a better word, I would call arbitrage, where you use South African capabilities that may be less costly to bring your products or your investment through the development pipeline onto the clinic or the market. Is it something that is possible from a fund management or fund development perspective?
And it's a great question, Dr. Msomi, and I definitely think, look, licensing some of the upstream IP, running local, cost-effective clinical trials in South Africa where we have edge or unique edge or advantage is definitely something, you know, that in my view is extremely low-hanging fruit. I mean, you and I have kind of started various conversations where I think this is a huge opportunity worth exploring, and if South Africa can position itself well to get access to some of the international IP, obviously, you know, it wants to develop its, you know, its own IP internally, but to the extent there is IP that exists internationally that needs to go through, you know, some of these clinical trials, I think we have both a cost and expertise advantage. And, you know, from an investment perspective, ultimately everything is about edge. And, you know, South Africa needs to look at the resources, the infrastructure, and the expertise we have, define those, and then do a much better job at promoting that to the right places. And, you know, I think just given the convergence of multiple trends, you know, be it AI, next generation sequencing, cell and gene therapy, you know, the improved probability of success for a number of clinical trials, I think, has gone up. So this space is only going to increase in both the quantum of funding it receives, the amount of opportunity, and, you know, I think all the panelists have touched on, you know, the GDP multiplier effect that we could generate locally by positioning ourselves effectively. So I'll be looking to position myself to take advantage if I was you know, promoting this from a South African perspective.
Thank you. And I want to turn back to Moss, if he's still here. I don't know whether Moss is still here, because I had a question for him.
I'm here, Msomi, I'm here.
Okay, you're hidden from view. One of the biggest gripes in terms of the innovation ecosystem in South Africa is what they call lack of funding. And I think when they say lack of funding, they're talking about lack of visible institutional funding. You alluded to the fact that there are angel investors, family offices, crowdfunding, and the like. How would you see that being mobilized and deployed to funding innovative biotechnology SMEs or startups?
I mean, I think that, you know, as I think, you know, Andre and Paul, you know, have indicated, particularly Paul and Brian, you know, the funding system in South Africa is fairly underdeveloped, both from a venture capital point of view, as well as from an institutional point of view. I mean, the reason why you have institutions like TIA and the CSR looking at funding this is because the financial market in South Africa is quite lethargic when it deals with startups and new ventures. And therefore, there's a need to really look at different alternatives. And those alternatives are beginning to emerge. You know, I mean, Dr. Msomi, you know that, you know, over the last, you know, 10, 15 years, you know, within my own company, I've been the one person who's been quite aggressive in promoting the funding of startups. As you know, we funded a couple of startups at the moment. We're in the process of developing, you know, the Meditech, Ashley Ailes is going to be speaking here. We funded him. So the South African system is still very underdeveloped from a funding point of view. The solutions that are beginning to emerge, you know, some of the families that are emerging in the marketplace are putting money into biotech and innovation centers are there, but they're not sufficient. The CSR collaboration with private sector, I think, Paul, it hasn't moved as much as, you know, in the last 15 years since you left. There's still a lot of red tape there that we have to deal with. But I think that I'm chairman of South African Breweries Foundation. And we run an innovation, you know, program where we invite young South Africans to submit their innovation for adjudication, and those that win in that process, we get to fund them through their development stage, proof of concept stage, and we are in the process of engaging with TIA to make sure that they can join us in developing the funding mechanisms and the funding pool that is there for entrepreneurs. So in short, very underdeveloped, still lethargic, lack of participation by the private sector by and large. But I think that there are emerging trends that needs to be supported. One of those is, foundations like the SAP Foundation running this innovation programs and funding interesting projects. I mean, we have a project that is going through a Series A funding project around the glaucoma. This was funded by SAP Foundation. Now is at the stage where it can approach the international market and go through to the international market, fund more funding.
Dr. Msomi, if I could just add a couple of things to what Moss was saying there, because I think it's interesting. If you go back to the year 2000, if you look at the number of listed companies we have in the US relative to now, the number of companies is halved. The purveyors of capital, be they venture funds, private equity funds, hedge funds, the number's up 100-fold and the amount of capital's up 1,000-fold. So there's a very clear macro trend of money shifting from the public markets to the private markets. And I think what's been touched on by the panelists here and Brian as well was, in early stage investing is a very high risk endeavor. And, we know the money exists from institutions because I've raised across my two funds, Bravos Capital 1 and Bravos Capital 2, close to $500 million. And 80% of that has come from South African institutions and high net worth individuals, family offices. And I think, as more value is being created on the private side, where you can offer a product that is able to diversify your risk. And, what's very unique about the OSI structure is being set up as a company. So the benefits, as opposed to a fund, the benefits will ultimately accrue to the shareholders, the owners of the business. I think, what we really need to figure out are what are the right mechanisms to get into these available pools of institutional funding, because in a world where interest rates have been compressed and alpha has been depressed, to the extent we can offer a platform approach. And I think the early stage space is becoming more commoditized, and that'll continue to play out. So the more innovative we can be establishing platforms, our own platform, it doesn't need to look or smell like OSI, but, offering investors diversification, access to power law of returns, where one or two companies will more than compensate for all the ones that fail in a diversified, very measured way, I think will attract more capital. And ultimately, that's what builds out ecosystem and will lead to edge and advantage.
Thank you, Andre. And I think we've got 10 minutes left. So I'm going to go in this order. I'll start with Paul. Maybe just a quick comment on your journey as an entrepreneur, because I know you've traversed both sides. You felt the pain on the other side, which we all have felt, and then you've given the pain on the other side as well when you've invested. Just a quick 2 cents there, and then that'll be followed by Stephen, and then close off with Brian. Thank you.
Sure. So, you wouldn't believe I'm only 23 years old, but I look about 70, but that's the life of an entrepreneur, right? So, just to speak to some of the previous points that both Andre and Moss were referring to, and that is that, is there an economic arbitrage in the sort of Southern African environment? Absolutely. I would argue that there is not at this point an efficiency arbitrage. So I'm sorry, you would know the clinical research business that I was involved in historically in South Africa, where you could offer a product or a suite of services at a fraction of the cost that you could in a North American or European environment. But the red tape, certainly in terms of the approvals of the research and the investigation of medicinal products, protocols, etc., really just dampened the enthusiasm of foreign parties looking to conduct clinical research there. Now, I think to some extent it's improving, and in fact, in one of my businesses here, we provide product into the clinical research space, and one of our clients is in fact starting their global program in South Africa quite shortly. So it seems that things have to some extent improved in terms of those sort of efficiencies through the system. So I think that's an important bottleneck that needs to be unlocked. I think the second point is, that Andre referred to. It's been a fairly shotgun approach in terms of early stage investing, particularly in the life sciences sector in South Africa. So if you can create a platform that that allows people to not necessarily a one-stop shop, but at least a place that they can go to where they know they're going to get a fair hearing, I think that's an ideal solution. And I think certainly one of the most important lessons that I learned having operated on both sides of the pond is that failure is not a bad thing, and in the South African context, it is seen as a bad thing. You have businesses that don't work out in the South African environment, and you're either seen as a pariah or an unsuccessful entrepreneur. Whereas the same thing happens here as it has to me, and you're not necessarily you're the guy that's given it a go and it didn't work out, and that's just the way it is. And in fact, you have a speaker speaking at the conference today, I think, in Atherton Mutambwera from Hutana Diagnostics. So that's an Oxford spin out. And I sit on his board, and it's been an interesting journey with him from, a real startup and kind of pivoting from great success to almost failure in this roller coaster ride that is a learning curve for all parties. But, irrespective of the outcome of a business like that, he will walk away with tremendous lessons and successes. And the markets will look at him thinking, this is the guy that tried. And I think it's a mindset shift that needs to happen in the South African environments. But, those that just try need to be rewarded, irrespective of the outcomes.
Thank you, Paul. Stephen, 3 minutes. Your 3 minutes.
So, thanks. Those very interesting comments there on management that have tried and failed. I would make the comment that actually some of the points made here are also problems in the UK. So in the UK, funding has for many years until relatively recently been a huge challenge for the biotech industry in comparison to the States, for example. And even today, the identification of top management in the UK is tough. It's you can get someone to run the company, but you're wanting someone who's in the top 10 to 15% of management talent in a company of this kind, if you want to have a real shot at things. So it's something which intrigues me in some ways, and I'll comment on the fantastic presentation on OSI. I thought it was brilliant. The question there is, and actually for South Africa as well, starting the company is one thing, and oddly, however hard it is, the work you do in that time, it's the easiest thing to initiate in comparison to trying to finish a company. And finish a company means drawing in the capital, drawing in the managerial talent that can compete on an international level, ideally, is hugely demanding. And in the UK, to this day, finding top CEOs is a bottleneck. We have lots of seedlings developing, but identifying the best talent is difficult. And that's because the more companies we have in the UK, the more we're competing against each other for that talent. In South Africa, it wouldn't surprise me that because it's more early in its development as an industry, you may well find that it could even be easier to identify than in the UK, which doesn't sound logical, but we are competing against each other with all these companies starting up. And I'd be interested to know what Andre's solution to the talent problem is.
No, it's a great question, Stephen. And I would say, I think in the post-COVID world we're operating in now, that there has never been a brighter spotlight on, and certainly that was helped by the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. But I think you've got a couple of things at play. One, you've got this wall of money transitioning from public to private. You've got a valuation discrepancy between the US and the UK. And I think in a post-COVID world, you don't need to live 10 miles within the M25 in the UK to sit in a board of a spin-out company. We need to be far more ambitious. And frankly, as a South African living for a long period of time in the UK, I think one of the biggest ingredients that's been missing, certainly from the UK, and I can't talk with any authority for South Africa, is real ambition, and ambition to build multi-billion-pound companies. Success in the UK seems to represent selling, a sequencing company, from Cambridge to Illumina. The headline in the UK would have been biggest exit ever for a diagnostic company or sequencing company. Whereas in the US, they turned it from 600 million into a $70 billion company in just outside of a decade. So I think it's mindset.
I can comment on that actually, because there were reasons we did that. And first of all, we could not possibly develop the company in terms of accessing capital in the UK. It was just not possible. And secondly, we couldn't access the level of engineering skills, which were all largely on the West Coast at that time. And I think thirdly, we managed to hook a top-class CEO through the process. So, but anyhow, back to you.
No, and look, I think those points are really well made.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we're going to be interrupted as they move across to another plenary. And I would like to invite you to a continuation of this discussion. It was much too short. I did say at the beginning that it's something that we are going to start as a series because it's an important conversation. But for the last word, I would like to give Brian the last 2 minutes before he starts hating me and blackballing me. Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Nhlanhla. And I think a big thank you to all the panelists. If there's any one take home for me is that this discussion has validated our policymakers' decision to invest in South Africa's Nuclear Medicine Research Institute, which, if anything, leverages our predisposition and propensity to accelerate drug development, in addition to all the other obvious things like your infrastructure, our top medical specialists, and so on and so forth. And lastly, we recognize the value of angel investors, and Moss, to you specifically. I'm keen to discuss the small matter of access. And that's all from me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for a very insightful and exciting dialogue. And as I said, I do promise that I will be calling on all of you. Hopefully, Moss will host us, or Stephen, when he comes to Cape Town, will host us, and we can read that nice collection from your cellar. But this conversation needs to be taken forward. It's a very important conversation. The world has just experienced a huge event, and we need to think differently around capital formation. And what I've heard today has given me some insights and illuminated the real discussion that needs to be had about different ways of doing this in a manner that's strategic. How do you leverage, how do you arbitrage, and all of that. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful session. Thanks.